When my husband passed away after 40 years of marriage, the silence in our house felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Every room carried memories. His chair by the window, the old coffee mug he used every morning, the creak of the hallway floor where he used to walk late at night when he couldn't sleep. At first, I tried to stay strong. I told myself I could live alone, that I could manage the house just fine. But loneliness has a strange way of creeping into your heart, especially at night. My son Daniel began calling more often after the funeral. He sounded worried. One evening, he came to visit and sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Mom, you shouldn't stay here alone," he said gently. "Come live with us. The house is big, and the kids would love having you around." His wife Laura smiled politely beside him and nodded. "Of course," she added. "It would be nice to have family close." I hesitated at first. I didn't want to feel like a burden, and I valued my independence. But Daniel insisted. Eventually, I packed a few boxes, said goodbye to the quiet house that had once been full of life, and moved into their home across town. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was modern and spacious, with bright windows and a backyard where my grandson played every afternoon. I helped with small things around the house, folding laundry, cooking dinner once or twice a week, and picking up my grandson from school when Laura was busy. Daniel worked long hours at a financial firm, often leaving before sunrise and returning late in the evening. When he was home, Laura seemed warm and friendly. She would ask about my day, offer me tea, and laugh at little jokes. But slowly I began noticing something strange. Whenever Daniel left for work, Laura's attitude shifted. Her voice became colder. Her smiles disappeared. At first it was small things. She would sigh loudly if I entered the kitchen while she was cooking. If I sat in the living room, she would walk in, glance around the room, and then walk out again as if checking something. I tried to ignore it. I told myself maybe she was just stressed. One afternoon I was washing dishes when she walked past me and opened a cabinet. She paused, stared at something inside, then muttered under her breath, "That's strange." I asked if everything was okay. She shrugged without looking at me. "Just noticing things are different when extra people live in a house." The word stung, though she never said my name. I stood there quietly holding a wet plate, unsure how to respond. From that moment on, the air in the house felt tense whenever Daniel wasn't around. I started moving more carefully, trying not to get in anyone's way. I kept my belongings in my room and spent long hours reading or watching television alone. Sometimes I wondered if I had made a mistake leaving my old home. But I didn't want to upset Daniel, so I kept telling myself things would improve with time. The first real accusation came about a week later. Laura walked into the kitchen while I was making tea and held up her phone charger in the air like it was evidence. Her expression was tight and suspicious. "Did you take my charger?" she asked flatly. I looked up, confused by the question. "No, dear," I said gently. "I haven't seen it." She stared at me for a moment, her eyes searching my face as if trying to catch me lying. Then she sighed dramatically and leaned against the counter. "That's strange," she muttered. "It was right here this morning." I felt uncomfortable but tried to stay calm. "Maybe it's in your room," I suggested. She shrugged and walked away without responding. Later that evening, I heard Laura speaking quietly to Daniel in their bedroom. The door wasn't completely closed, and though I couldn't hear every word, I caught enough to understand the tone. She sounded frustrated, almost annoyed. The next morning, Daniel barely looked at me during breakfast. He answered my greeting politely but seemed distracted. My chest tightened with worry. Over the following weeks, small incidents began happening regularly. One day, Laura couldn't find her sunglasses. Another day, she said $50 had disappeared from her purse. Each time, she made sure to mention it while I was nearby. She never pointed directly at me, but her tone always carried the same implication. She would sigh loudly, glance in my direction, and say things like, "I don't understand how things just vanish." The tension began to affect me deeply. I started avoiding common areas of the house, spending most of my time in my bedroom. Instead of joining them for dinner, I would quietly prepare something small for myself later. I didn't want to create conflict, and I certainly didn't want my grandson to witness arguments. Daniel remained busy with work and rarely noticed the growing distance between Laura and me. When he was around, Laura behaved kindly again, smiling and chatting as if nothing was wrong. That made it even harder to explain the situation to him. I worried he wouldn't believe me if I tried. The house that had once felt welcoming slowly began to feel like a place where I was constantly being watched. Every small movement made me nervous. If I picked up something from the counter, I made sure to return it immediately. If I entered the kitchen, I checked everything twice before leaving. Yet no matter how careful I was, Laura's suspicious glances never stopped. It felt as if she had already decided who the guilty person was. One afternoon, the tension finally exploded into something I could no longer ignore. I was sitting in the living room reading when Laura suddenly walked in holding a small jewelry box. Her face was flushed with anger. She placed the box on the coffee table and opened it dramatically. "My necklace is gone," she said sharply. I looked up, startled by her tone. "I'm sure it will turn up," I replied calmly. She laughed bitterly and crossed her arms. "Of course you'd say that." My grandson stopped playing with his toy cars and looked between us with confusion. I could feel my heart beginning to race. "I didn't take anything," I said quietly. Laura stepped closer, her voice rising slightly. "You think I'm stupid?" she snapped. I felt my hands tremble. "No, of course not." She shook her head in frustration. "Well, since you're the only one home all day, who else could it be?" The accusation hung in the air like a heavy weight. My cheeks burned with humiliation. Never in my life had anyone called me a thief. I had spent decades raising a family, working hard, and building a life with honesty. And now I was being treated like a criminal in my own son's home. My grandson looked frightened, so I forced myself to remain calm. "I would never steal from family," I said softly. Laura scoffed and turned away, muttering under her breath, "A thief shouldn't live in my house." The words cut deeper than she probably realized. My chest tightened and my eyes filled with tears, but I refused to cry in front of her. That evening, Daniel came home late again. Laura greeted him warmly, acting cheerful as if nothing had happened. I watched them from the hallway and realized something painful. In his eyes, everything was normal. He had no idea what had been happening while he was gone. That night, I sat quietly in my room thinking about the past months. The suspicious looks, the whispered accusations, the growing humiliation. I realized that if I stayed, things would only become worse. My dignity meant more than convenience. And so, as the house fell silent that night, I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. The house was quiet and still, the early sunlight slipping through the curtains. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened. My heart felt heavy, but my mind was clear. I knew I couldn't continue living in a place where I was treated with suspicion and disrespect. Slowly, I began packing a small suitcase. I didn't take much, just a few clothes, my medications, some photographs of my late husband, and the small notebook where I kept important papers. Every item I placed inside the suitcase felt like a quiet goodbye. I moved carefully so I wouldn't wake anyone. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table one last time. Memories flashed through my mind of the first weeks after I had moved in, when I still believed everything would be peaceful. It hurt to realize how quickly things had changed. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and placed it on the counter where Daniel would easily see it. The message was simple. I don't want to be a burden. I think it's better if I live somewhere else. Take care of yourselves. I didn't accuse Laura or explain the details. I knew Daniel would eventually understand, or perhaps he wouldn't. Either way, I had to leave for my own peace of mind. I called a taxi and quietly walked out of the house. The cool morning air felt strangely freeing. I moved into a small apartment across town that I had arranged the previous day after making a few phone calls. The apartment was modest, just a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a small living area, but it felt calm and safe. No suspicious glances. No whispered accusations. I spent the first few days unpacking slowly and adjusting to the quiet. Weeks passed. Daniel called once to ask if I was all right. His voice sounded confused more than concerned. Laura never contacted me at all. I didn't chase them or try to explain further. Instead, I focused on building a peaceful routine in my new place. I read books, took walks, and began enjoying the simple freedom of living without tension. Yet deep inside, I knew something important remained hidden. Something Daniel had never fully understood about the house he was living in. I had kept that truth to myself for many years. And when the time came, revealing it would change everything they thought they knew. 6 months passed before Daniel finally came to visit my apartment. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He looked exhausted, his face lined with stress. He stepped inside and glanced around the small living room, clearly surprised by how modest it was. "Mom, why did you leave like that?" he asked after a moment. I offered him tea and gestured for him to sit down. "You know why," I said gently. He looked uncomfortable and rubbed his hands together. "Laura said things were going missing," he replied. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I know she said that." For a moment we sat in silence. Then I walked to my desk and opened a small drawer. Inside was an envelope I had kept safe for years. I placed it on the table in front of him. "What's this?" Daniel asked. "Open it." He pulled out the papers and began reading. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed from confusion to shock. "This is our house," he said slowly. I nodded. "Yes." He looked at me in disbelief. "What do you mean?" I folded my hands calmly. "I bought the house 10 years ago." Daniel's face went pale. "You own the house?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. "When you and Laura were struggling financially, I decided to help. I bought the house and let you live there so you could raise your family comfortably." Daniel stared at the documents, speechless. For years, he had believed the house belonged to him. Laura certainly believed it did. But the truth was very different. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked finally. I sighed softly. "Because I didn't want you to feel embarrassed or dependent. I wanted you to believe you had built something on your own." Daniel leaned back in his chair, still stunned by the revelation. But I wasn't finished yet. There was another envelope waiting on the desk. And what it contained would reveal a truth far more painful than the ownership of a house. I placed the second envelope on the table and pushed it toward Daniel. He looked at it uncertainly. "What's in this one?" he asked. "Security reports," I replied calmly. He frowned and opened it. Inside were printed screenshots and timestamps. "When I bought the house," I explained, "I installed security cameras for safety. They're small and hidden. I never mentioned them because there was never a reason to." Daniel picked up one of the papers, studying the images closely. I turned on my laptop and opened several video files. The room grew quiet except for the faint sound of the recordings playing. On the screen, Laura appeared in the living room late at night. In one clip, she placed a necklace inside a drawer. In another, she removed cash from her own purse and tucked it behind a book on a shelf. Later clips showed her searching dramatically for those same items while speaking loudly about things being stolen. Daniel watched in stunned silence. His breathing became heavier with every video. "She lied," he whispered. I nodded slowly. Yes. Every accusation she made was part of a story she created. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he closed the laptop. The truth was finally impossible to ignore. For months, he had unknowingly believed that his own mother might be responsible for theft in his home. Now he could see exactly what had been happening. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small living room. Anger flashed across his face, mixed with disbelief and guilt. "I trusted her," he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. There was nothing I could say to ease the weight of that realization. After a moment, Daniel grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door. "I need to go home," he said firmly. I watched him leave without trying to stop him. The truth had finally surfaced, and what happened next was no longer in my hands. 2 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door late in the afternoon. When I opened it, Laura stood outside. Her eyes were red and swollen as if she had been crying for hours. She looked completely different from the confident woman who had once accused me so easily. "I made a mistake," she said immediately, her voice shaking. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "A big mistake," she added, lowering her gaze. She stepped inside slowly and clasped her hands together nervously. "Daniel showed me the videos," she said. He's furious. He barely speaks to me. I listened quietly, feeling a strange mix of sadness and calm. Laura wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Please come back, she begged. If you return and forgive me, maybe everything can go back to normal. I looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Normal? I repeated softly. She nodded desperately. Daniel said if you don't forgive me, our marriage might not survive. Her words hung in the air. For a moment I thought about the months of humiliation I had endured, the quiet dinners alone in my room, the constant feeling of being watched and judged. Then I shook my head gently. You didn't just accuse me of stealing, I said. You took away my dignity. Tears streamed down her face. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry. The apology sounded sincere, but something inside me had already changed. Respect, once broken so deeply, is not easily restored. I stepped toward the door and opened it slowly. Some apologies come too late, I said quietly. Laura stood there for a moment, realizing there was nothing else she could say. Eventually, she walked away down the hallway. Weeks later, Daniel moved out of the house and began rebuilding his life. He visited me often after that, bringing my grandson to spend time together. Our relationship slowly healed, though the memory of everything that had happened never fully disappeared. As for the house, I eventually sold it. Some places hold too many painful memories. A house can be rebuilt or replaced, but trust is far more fragile. And once it is broken, even the strongest walls cannot make it whole again.